Bosgame kind of caught me off guard late last year. They're a mini PC manufacturer I honestly wasn't very familiar with, and the system they sent over ended up being one of the best value mini PCs I reviewed in 2025. No gimmicks, no strange design choices, just solid hardware at a price that actually made sense. So when we rolled into 2026 and Bosgame reached out again with the Ryzen AI 9 HX370 powered M6 and specifically asked for a Linux focused look on lifting Linux, that immediately had my attention. What I want to do in this video is step back and look at the whole picture. This is about understanding what this mini PC is actually capable of when you pair the hardware with an often misunderstood Linux operating system like Bazzite, and whether that combination holds up as a complete system rather than something built for a single use case. Gaming is where everything comes together, but it's not the only thing that matters here. This is the Bosgame M6 built around AMD's Ryzen AI 9 HX370. Rather than running down a spec sheet line by line, I want to focus on the parts that actually matter once you start using the system. The HX370 is a Strix point-based SoC with 12 cores and 24 threads built on Zen 5, and it can run at power levels up to 54 watts. That puts it in a very different category than the low-power chips you see in a lot of mini PCs. Graphics are handled by AMD's Radeon 890M integrated iGPU, which is already far beyond what most people still picture when they hear the phrase integrated graphics. This unit ships with 32 gigabytes of a very endangered kit of crucial DDR5 memory and a 1 terabyte Kingston PCIe Gen 4 NVMe SSD. Jokes aside, that configuration gives the system enough breathing room that it's not immediately constrained by memory or storage, which matters once you start doing anything more demanding than basic desktop work. Wireless connectivity is handled by Wi-Fi 6E and Bluetooth 5.2, and this part really matters for Linux. Bosgame uses an Intel AX series Wi-Fi adapter. Intel's Wi-Fi remains the gold standard on Linux, and right out of the box, networking on this system is completely painless. On the wired side, you also get dual 2.5 gigabit Ethernet, which is still rare to see on a lot of mini PCs. For I/O, there's a full-featured 40 gigabit USB 4 port with display output and power delivery, along with HDMI 2.1 and DisplayPort 1.4 for external displays. There are also audio jacks on both the front and the back of the system, which is a small detail, but one I genuinely appreciate. And then there's the feature that really changes what a mini PC like this can be: OCuLink. OCuLink matters because it turns this from a fixed performance box into something you can scale later. It opens the door to external GPUs without the overhead and limitations of USB, and that changes how far a system like this can realistically go. We'll come back to that once we get into gaming. Before any of that, the operating system choice matters just as much as the hardware, which begs the question, why Bazzite? Well, besides the fact that Bosgame Beyondmax Bazzite box makes for a great YouTube title, because if I'm being totally honest, historically, immutable Linux distributions haven't been my preference. I've always gravitated towards wide open Linux systems where I can tweak, mod, and mold everything into my own thing, but as I get older, my priorities are changing. In a lot of cases now, I just want a system that works without effort all the time. Windows has become increasingly hostile to focused work, aggressive ads, forced Microsoft accounts, data harvesting, unwanted features like Copilot, frequent bugs, and updates that interrupt workflows or just break the system. On the other side, macOS is locked down and proprietary, but it largely delivers on that "it just works" promise. I've been using an M1 Max Mac Studio as my primary workstation for almost 4 years, and while I don't love Apple's ecosystem, the consistency, it's hard to ignore. Bazzite lands right in the middle. It's locked down enough that you can't easily break it in an unrecoverable way, but it still gives you the flexibility to do almost anything you actually need. It's fully open source, secure, and privacy respecting, and that makes it a really interesting pairing for a high-end mini PC like the M6. For this system, I downloaded Bazzite desktop for AMD hardware and went with the traditional desktop instead of Steam's game mode. At its core, Bazzite is a Fedora-based operating system, and on a machine with an HX 370 like the M6, treating it as a full desktop first just makes more sense than approaching it as a glorified game launcher. I used the Fedora Media Writer to create the install USB because, well, that's what the Bazzite developers recommend, and while the USB was being created, I jumped into Bosgame's UFVI. I made exactly one change here, switching the power profile from balanced to performance so the HX 370 could run at its full 54 watt power limit. That setting matters because it determines how aggressively the CPU is allowed to boost under load. After that, it was just a matter of booting from the USB drive and landing on the Bazzite live environment. One small detail I really like is that the live environment uses a wireframe version of the desktop wallpaper. It's a subtle visual cue that you're in a test environment, not the installed system. From there, you can poke around to get a feel for things or just launch the installer. The installer itself is about as simple as it gets. In my case, I chose to completely wipe the pre-installed Windows 11 installation. I have no use for it here, and this system is always going to live as a Linux-only machine. A few clicks later, the installation was finished, and it was time to reboot. No drama, no forced accounts, no errors, no driver hunting. On first boot, you land straight into the KDE Plasma desktop environment, and that choice is very deliberate. Plasma gives Bazzite the space to behave like a real desktop operating system, not just a gaming launcher with a UI bolted on. Right away, the basics fall into place. Wi-Fi connects immediately, Bluetooth pairs cleanly with an Xbox controller, audio works, displays behave exactly the way they should, and up to this point, nothing I've done requires a terminal, configuration files, or Linux tribal knowledge. You're just using a desktop. On displays, I do want to briefly acknowledge HDMI 2.1 because yes, HDMI 2.1 can still be problematic on Linux, especially when you're connecting to a TV or routing through an AVR, and that's a valid concern for living room gaming setups, and I'm not trying to downplay it. For PC gaming though, I'm almost always using a modern high refresh rate monitor, and DisplayPort 1.4 is very much an option here. The M6 has it, and using DisplayPort avoids most of the HDMI 2.1 headaches on Linux while still delivering the same real-world gaming features like high refresh rates, VRR, and HDR. For how I actually game on Linux, HDMI 2.1 limitations just aren't a major concern. Now, before touching the terminal at all, I update the system using the graphical update menu and then open Bazzar. This is where I want to slow things down because this is the part that really changes how Linux feels for most people. Bazzar presents a curated list of Flatpak applications, and this isn't just about convenience, it's about removing friction. Flatpaks are containerized applications that bundle their dependencies, which makes them far less likely to break when the underlying operating system changes. On an immutable distro like Bazzite, Flatpaks are the primary way you install software, and for most users, they're the only way you'll ever need. For gaming, that means one-click installs of Steam, Heroic launchers, RetroArch, Dolphin Emulator, and Minecraft Bedrock. But this system isn't just a gaming box. So I also installed OBS for recording and streaming, Kdenlive and GIMP for content creation, LibreOffice for productivity, Rust Rover and Visual Studio Code for development work. All of these install cleanly through Bazzar. All of them launch normally, and none of this requires opening a terminal. This is still just a desktop usage. At this point, it should be pretty clear that the Bosgame M6 running Bazzite isn't locked into a single role. It handles creative work, development, and everyday desktop tasks just as comfortably as it launches games. Now, eventually you might want something that isn't available as a flat pack, and that's where DistroBox comes in. And this is a part that scares people when they hear the word terminal. In practice, most users will never need to touch this at all. This is optional power, not a requirement. DistroBox is already installed and it lets you run software from other Linux distributions without touching the base operating system. Here, I can create an Ubuntu 2404 container, install the Vivaldi browser inside of it, and export it to the desktop so it shows up in the application menu like any native app. Once it's exported, it behaves like any other application. Launching a YouTube video, you can see hardware acceleration working, audio and video playback are smooth, and everything feels native. Style budget rig to show that off. The second most requested has been CachyOS, and today, even here, the terminal is a setup step, not something you live in. This is Immutable Linux offering flexibility without making you babysit the system. Of course, some software does need deeper system integration, and for that, Bazzite uses RPM Ostry. To demonstrate this, I install Molvad VPN. This does require reboot, and that's because Bazzite handles system changes a little differently than most operating systems. Instead of modifying the running system in place, it takes a snapshot of the current setup and then builds a new version of the operating system that includes the new VPN. When the PC restarts, you're not continuing where you left off, you're booting into that new version of Bazzite already set up with Molvad fully integrated at the system level. From here, I can enable the Molvad service, and it behaves exactly like you'd expect a VPN to behave on any desktop OS. Now, I don't have an active account here, but if I did, it would work normally. The important part is the original system never disappears. It's still there in the background untouched, which means if something goes wrong, you're not stuck trying to undo changes line by hand. Here's the key takeaway: that even when you do make system level changes, you're not locked in. If something behaves oddly or causes an issue, you can roll the operating system back to a previous state. Now, after the reboot, the system is back to the earlier Bazzite deployment, pre-VPN install, like it never happened. That rollback capability is one of the biggest reasons immutable distros feel stable day to day. You can experiment without fear, and most of the time, you never need to experiment at all. Now, Windows applications are usually the next question I typically get. To address that, I installed the Windows version of Notepad++ using Lutris. The installation completes, the app launches, and it behaves exactly the way you'd expect. No hacks, no strange behavior, and this isn't magic, but it does show that Bazzite doesn't cut you off from familiar tools you still need. Now, I do want to be honest here. Not every Windows application works like this. Microsoft Office, Adobe's Creative Suite, and Autodesk tools, to name a few, still don't run properly on Linux. Open source alternatives exist, but they aren't always drop-in replacements. For some professional workflows, including some of my own, Windows or Mac OS is unfortunately still necessary. That's just the reality today. Where Linux has made massive progress, especially in a relatively short amount of time, is gaming. Now, at this point, the system is set up, the operating system is stable with essentially no effort on my part. Software is installed, controllers are paired. Now it's time to do the thing this hardware name suggests it was built for. Steam is already pre-installed, so I can just launch it, log in, and start downloading games from my existing library. Compatibility is enabled by default, and if I want to, I can switch to Proton Experimental or install Proton Up Qt to pull in the latest GE Proton builds. Now, this moment matters because this is exactly where Linux gaming used to fall apart. Today, it's simply part of the out-of-box experience. From here on, the footage starts doing more of the talking. I installed a few lighter titles to get a feel for how the Strix Point system handles 1080p gameplay. Let's just jump in. We'll start with a native Vulkan title, Baldur's Gate 3. You can still force a DX11 launch if you want, but with recent updates, the game defaults to Vulkan, so that's what I'm using here. For all of these tests on the integrated Radeon 890M, I'm running at 1080p using low graphics presets and enabling FSR where it makes sense for the title. Not for this one though. Frame times are mostly very consistent, sitting between about 16 and 18 milliseconds with a nice straight frame time line through most gameplay. You'll see a few spikes during cutscenes, but during actual play, it's smooth and stutter free. Being GPU bound does show up in visual quality though. If you watch the textures closely, especially the rasterized shadows, they're rough, jagged initially, and tend to pop in at the last minute, which can be distracting. Even so, we're looking at an average frame rate of around 58 FPS with 1% lows right around 50 FPS. That's a very smooth and playable experience for this game on integrated graphics. Moving on to Counter-Strike 2, this is again 1080p low with FSR disabled. As is typical for this game, frame pacing is a bit more jagged, but we're maintaining frame rates above 120 FPS, which is perfectly fine for casual play. I ran this map about 6 times and the average consistently landed in the low to mid 130s with much tighter 1% lows than I actually expected. That gives us a frame time consistency of about 63%. That's not ideal for competitive play, but it's the best results I've seen from any mini PC I've ever tested. Now, I've got more games queued up, but before we keep rolling, if this kind of Linux-focused real-world hardware coverage is useful to you, well, that's exactly what I do here on Lifting Linux. I spend a lot of time testing how actual hardware actually behaves on Linux, not just whether it boots. So if you want more real-world Linux build, mini PCs, and deep dives like this, subscribing helps me keep doing that. And if you found this video helpful, a like also goes a long way too. All right, back to gaming. Next up is Marvel Rivals running at 1080p low with native resolution. As expected, performance here is rough at first, jagged frame pacing with frame rates hovering in the low 30s range. I chose this title intentionally though because on RDNA 3.5 hardware like the Radeon 890M, FSR support is quite good even on integrated graphics. Enabling FSR3 upscaling in balance mode along with FSR3 frame generation transforms the experience. With those settings enabled, the game averages around 70 FPS with 1% lows at about 63 FPS, making it far more smooth and playable. For Cyberpunk 2077, the story is similar. Using only FSR3 upscaling in quality mode, frame pacing is very smooth overall. There are a few spikes in dense outdoor scenes, which is expected, but the experience holds together well, delivering an average of about 72 FPS with 1% lows around 60 FPS. Taken as a whole, these are genuinely strong results for integrated graphics using shared system memory. The Radeon 890M isn't just running these games, it's doing so with consistent frame times and a level of smoothness that would have been unthinkable for iGPUs not that long ago. Now, every time I review a mini PC with OCuLink, I get the same question about Linux support. The short version is that it works and it works cleanly. OCuLink is just PCIe. From the operating system's point of view, there's no real difference between this and installing a graphics card into a desktop motherboard. There's no translation layer, no tunneling, and no special handling required at the OS level. So to turn this already serious mini PC into a full desktop class gaming machine, I connected my Minus Forum OCuLink dock, dropped in a Radeon RX 9070 XT, and powered everything on. Bazzite immediately detected the external GPU and set it as the primary graphics device. No scripts, no hacks, no driver juggling. It just works. Now, that experience is very deliberate. Bazzite images are built around specific GPU stacks, and this system is running the AMD image with an AMD GPU. All of the drivers are already baked in and maintained as part of the operating system. The kernel, Mesa, and Vulkan stack are already aligned, so there's nothing extra for the user to manage. Things do look different if you try to pair an NVIDIA GPU with the AMD focused Bazzite image. However, NVIDIA requires proprietary drivers, and on an immutable system like Bazzite, those drivers have to be layered on top of the base OS using RPM Ostry. That adds complexity and requires reboots and can introduce friction during updates. It works, but it's not the same frictionless experience you get when the GPU stack matches the OS image. With AMD on AMD through OCuLink feels exactly like what it's supposed to be, a direct extension of the system, not a workaround. Even with the GPU running over a Gen 4x4 OCuLink connection, adding the RX 9070 XT completely changes what this system can do. At this point, 1440p gaming is a given, and even 4K becomes very realistic. Starting again with Baldur's Gate 3, I'm able to push straight up to 4K Ultra with a very small amount of upscaling. Not only do resolution and image quality climb dramatically, but frame rates improve as well, while staying consistently smooth. There are still a few frame time spikes during cutscenes, but during gameplay, everything settles down nicely. You can clearly see that textures are fully resolved now, shadows aren't popping in at the last second, and volumetric lighting looks the way it's supposed to. In Counter-Strike 2, I stayed at 1080p low, but this time for a different reason. With the external GPU attached, frame rates and pacing jump firmly into competitive territory. Even with a less than ideal mouse and a 60Hz capture pipeline, latency feels much lower and the game is noticeably more responsive. I ran the map again 6 times and consistency here was immediately obvious. This finally feels like a desktop class performance. For Marvel Rivals, I ran the game at native 1440p high. The frame time graph shows a bit more jitter, but not enough to affect gameplay in any meaningful way. Final results are solid, and there's clearly room to tune settings further if you want to prioritize either smoothness or image quality. Moving over to Cyberpunk 2077, we're now looking at 4K Ultra with FSR 3 set to quality. Performance is very smooth and entirely playable with none of the frame time instabilities you'd expect from integrated graphics. This is exactly the kind of workload where the external GPU makes its value obvious. Where OCuLink really earns its keep though is in games that simply aren't realistic on integrated graphics. Clear Obscure Expedition 33 is a good example. With the RX 9070 XT attached, I'm able to run it at 4K Epic using FSR quality and still get genuinely playable performance. The same goes for Doom: The Dark Ages, which has ray tracing enabled by default. Here I'm running at 1440p Ultra with FSR balanced. This game blocks the Manglehood overlay and its own FPS counter jumps around quite a bit, but in actual play it feels smooth and responsive, which matters far more than raw numbers on screen. Now, at this point, cost matters because context matters. The Bosgame M6 is currently selling for $888, and on the surface that might not sound inexpensive for a mini PC, but once you break down what's actually in the box, the pricing starts to make a lot more sense. A 32GB DDR5 kit on its own is currently well over $300. Add a 1TB PCIe Gen 4 SSD, and that's another $100 to $150. Those two components alone already account for roughly half the cost of the system. From there, you're paying for Ryzen AI 9 HX370, the chassis, cooling, motherboard, power delivery, and networking. Looked at that way, this doesn't feel like inflated pricing at all. What's more interesting is where this lands in the broader market. When HX370 equipped mini PCs first launched, many of them were priced well north of $1,200. Even today, some of the bigger name brands still sit above this price point with similar configurations. Bosgame is coming in more than $300 under those early launch prices, and in some cases, undercutting current competitors outright. But value here isn't just about the numbers on the price tag, it's also about the decisions Bosgame made. The Intel AX series Wi-Fi adapter, dual 2.5 gigabit Ethernet, a clean and straightforward UEFI, and the absence of weird proprietary behavior all matters, especially on Linux. Those choices are the difference between a system that technically runs Linux and one that actually works well with it. That ties directly back to what I wanted to understand going into this video. The Bosgame M6 isn't just a powerful mini PC, it's a well-balanced one. Paired with Bazzite, it delivers a Linux experience that's stable, flexible, and low friction. It handles gaming, productivity, development, and content creation without consistently getting in your way. And when you factor in OCuLink and the ability to scale performance later, this stops looking like a short-term purchase and starts looking more like a platform you can grow into over time. For me, that combination of performance, Linux compatibility, and price is what makes this setup stand out and why Bosgame continues to impress.